Hello everyone, welcome to the very last class. Today I just finished up making questions for the final, and then I wanted to give you some hint. First of all, we talked about Plato and Aristotle, and then we talked about Plato and Aristotle, and the Plato didn't like democracy, but we could find some advantages from the Aristotle about the democracy. So I want you to focus on why, in what sense, that what's the clue that Plato didn't like democracy. And then we talked about justice of Plato. And then, justice is he thinks that contribute his own work for the common use of all in order to so people within the city must work together as a single unit by dividing the labor into categories which best suit the individual. That's the justice. But for injustice means the people if people meddling and exchange among three classes. So these three classes that you should start with to explain the justice. I think you should know what is three different classes, and where the three class come from, right? And then he talked about we learned allegory of cave, and then we also talk about ship, allegory of ship, and throughout these two story we can tell that Plato didn't like democracy much, and democracy is unjust, right? And then you have to give detailed explanations why Plato didn't like democracy, and then he believed in philosopher king. He thinks that the philosopher king should be the king, but we could find some democratic factors from Plato, such as that he also believes that woman could be a leader. That's a good part. And the education. He thinks that if, even though the parents are born with iron, some people born with gold. And these people, even though they regardless of their parents, these people can be a leader, right? But Aristotle, from the very beginning, he's a good he provide good argument for supporting democracy. So he believed that humans are social and political creature, and but he excluded woman and slave. And he also talked about happiness. What's the goal of happiness? And then for human to be happy, we have to use our reason, and that's the one of the reasons of being happy. And he talked about how can we use our reason. So uh, so he talked about like citizens, right? So he talked about in discussions of the citizens. He gives a lot of hint how we could use our reason, right? First of all, we need to use our reason for deliberation or decision making process, right? And then so this red light, I gave you hint how he uh, support democracy, and I want you to use this. And then, even though Aristotle support very strongly the democracy, he did not think that democracy is the best regime type. It's because he worries that the democracy is the many is the poor, the needy, and then the democracy might work for interests of the needy. So you should talk about that. And then there are some non-democratic factors from Aristotle, and then that is he excluded women and slave, and then he also uh, talk about the best regime type, that is polity, and then you have discussed why polity is the best regime type for Aristotle. And then so was the comparison between Plato and Aristotle, and then we can see which one, how these two great scholars differ from each other, right? And that is first one that I wanted to emphasize. Second is, as I promised to you, I'll ask the role of state to you. It was quite difficult to understand the Weber. This is the Weber's political realist Weber's perspective, that is, state as a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the state legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. So according to the realist Weber's perspective, he emphasized monopoly of legitimate use of physical force. And then we talked about the problems that Weber's this definition, right? And then he developed more of the definition is this: a composite political association with continuous operations will be called a state insofar as its administrative staff successfully uphold the claim to be monopoly of legitimate use of physical force in enforcement its order. Social action, especially the action of association, will be spoken of a politically oriented the extent in which it aims exerting influence on the leadership of political association or location of powers of government. So this is reflective and anti-functionalist Weber's perspective. So we call this post-Weberian, right? And then this one emphasizes what? Administrative capacity, right? So the first one only talking about the legitimate physical, uh, legitimate using the physical force, right? But this one is also talking about the administrative capacity, or the how and why we should use physical force, right? And then the last one we talked about legitimacy. So the problem of this definition is absence of legitimacy, right? So absence of legitimacy, why we talked about legitimacy, that's what we discussed during the class. Legitimacy is a quality that are attributed by population, which is the outcome of government's capacity to engender legitimacy. The governed have any form of agency at all. So that's it. That if you recalled why we need legitimacy. If we do not have a legitimacy, then what happened? We spend a lot of time for that, right? And then the last one we talked about this. So this is more this is related to the legitimacy, the relation approach to the state. And then the important questions we have to ask is, why do men and women obey those who seek to govern them? That's the related to the legitimacy too. So I want you to follow each definitions, and then what's the problem with it. I mean, I spent a lot for that, but I'm asking this question because it gives a lot of hint to the democracy. And I mean, throughout this semester, we talked about what is democracy, what is a good way of democracy, right? So I want you to think about what is why this matters in democracy. Uh, and lastly, I want you to emphasize one thing that is the very last we talked about. That is realism and liberalism. So the basic realism starts with human nature, and then you have to understand how these realists understand the human nature, right? Either human nature bad or not, right? And then there is classical realism, and after the classical realism, it developed more, and then it's focused on the uh, anarchic condition. So that's actually the main difference between domestic politics and international relations. And anarchy. Why do you think the realist thinks that anarchy matters? And then the the later on, after the classical realist, this structural realist talked about distribution of power, and you have to understand why they focus on distribution of power. And then we talked about different distribution of power: unipolar system, bipolar system, multipolar system. And you have to understand what's the main difference between or among three different isms. I know I'm three different the polar system. So unipolar, bipolar, multipolar. Which one is the most peaceful? What's the problem of it? Like that. And then lastly, we talked about basic assumptions of uh, realism. The realism's basic assumption. First thing, it's easy to calculate cost and benefit because they understand human being as utility maximizer. And second is state preference are not changed. So state preference is economy or military, so it doesn't change. It's easy to calculate. The most important thing is anarchy. Anarchical condition never changed. And then you have to understand relative gain versus absolute gain. So the realists understand international relations as relative gains, but liberalists understand international relations as absolute gains. If you have to understand that, and realism, we start talk about human nature as well. So we start with Locke, right? John Locke, and John Locke thinks that human beings are God's property, and then everything is perfect. But so state of nature is also good and perfect. Then he understands the human nature as a good altruistic. So that's why in international relations there is always cooperation. That's only liberalism, but we start Kant. Kant talk about three things. The first one is liberal institutionalism. Second, democratic peace theory. Third, trade peace theory. Especially, I want you to focus on more liberal institutionalism because liberal institutions accept the realism's basic assumption that is states are unitary actors and system of anarchy. Even though they accept this, uh, still the liberal institutionalists come up with solving the problems of this is international organization. So throughout international organization, we can solve the problems of corporations, right? That's what I want. So we talked about collective action problems. I'll definitely ask that. And collective action problems, how collective action problems can be solved. And then based on that, we come up with realism and liberalism, and you have to discuss that part. So I asked the three questions, and I talked about three things, right? So you have to focus on these three things. Well, sure, you have to discuss what you think that's the most important to get the good point. So good luck with everything. Thank you for taking my class. Bye.